So I just want to give you a brief potted introduction to 17th century French theatre. It's a type of theatre which has often been typecast. People often think of it in terms of certain cliches. Now those cliches do have some grounding in reality, but I think there is a lot more to the reality than people give the theatre credit for. In France, the period is often known as the classical age, l'âge classique, and that word classical often evokes, for example, maybe statues, architecture. It gives the impression of things being quite fixed, grand, impersonal, maybe immobile, rather boring and dusty, if also quite impressive. Now, there's an element of that, I'm not going to deny it, but in fact, what I want to suggest is that these plays were written with an audience in mind. They were written to have a very dramatic impact on their spectators. This theatre is associated quite often with what people call the rules, or sometimes known as the three unities of time, place, and action. There were a few other rules that I'll touch on a little bit later. The cliche about these rules is that they try to boil everything down into, as the word unity implies, one measurement for each thing. The unity of time is that things should take place in the space of a single day. The unity of place means that things should take place in one location, and the action means that there should be one main plot with no extraneous unrelated subplots. That's how things are often understood. In fact, the real definitions that were sometimes used, well, they were debated at the time. There isn't one fixed meaning or definition, but the debates around them often reveal that these are not these abstract ideas. They're not a straitjacket placed onto dramatists to restrict their creativity, their creative freedom, but rather they were there for a particular dramatic purpose. So the unity of place, for example, means that there should be no changes of scene. Sometimes people would take the unity of place to mean, oh, it takes place in a particular city or sometimes in a particular castle. The strictest interpretation was that it should take place in one particular room of a castle or a house or whatever, and that it shouldn't move around. That was the strictest interpretation that was given. The reason for this that was often given for this was that it helps to preserve the dramatic illusion. If you've ever watched a play and in between scenes you have stagehands coming on, picking up furniture, moving it around, and moving props around on stage, it breaks the continuity of what we're watching. It breaks that dramatic illusion. Likewise, the unity of time. Often people say it has to take place within a single day, sometimes understood as 24 hours, sometimes within the daylight, I suppose, and more like 12 hours. In fact, the strictest version of that was that the duration of the performance should not, or the duration of the action being represented, should not exceed the duration of the performance. So the play itself, when we're watching it, might last 2.5 hours. So ideally, the events that take place within the play shouldn't take longer than 2.5 hours. Now in practice, because there are intervals when we're not paying attention to time passing, people were allowed to sort of sneak more time into the plot, and maybe sort of as if the intervals are sort of fast forwarding through dead time when nothing very dramatic or interesting is happening, things that we're not watching on stage. But the ideal then is that you don't have, for example, as you would in Shakespeare, sometimes a leap from one time to another. In Shakespeare, sometimes you'll get a leap of like 16 years between Acts 4 and 5 of A Winter's Tale, I think it is. You couldn't have anything like that in French theatre of the time because, again, it breaks that continuity, the continuity of the dramatic illusion. The audience hasn't aged 16 years, so why should the characters have done so? The unities of time and place are there to cater for a certain idea of how people watch plays. The unity of action is slightly different, a bit more complicated, but again, the purpose of the unity of action is to keep people's attention on the main plot. There shouldn't be any extraneous subplots that distract our attention, but rather keep us focused on the events as they're happening. So a related idea is that of vraisemblance. Vraisemblance, seeming true. The English word is rather cumbersome and Latinate, verisimilitude, so people tend to use, even in English, the French word vraisemblance, which is clearer to understand, seeming true. Now this doesn't mean seeming true in the sense of 19th century realist novels, for example, gritty novels about working class people or whatever, but rather I would say that vraisemblance is an attempt to approximate a stylized ideal of truth. It's perhaps better to try to define vraisemblance in terms of what it doesn't include. And what it doesn't include is anything that draws the spectator's attention to the dramatist's hand controlling events. So, for example, in real life, sometimes people die, for example, unexpectedly. That wouldn't work in a tragedy. Tragedies often involve death, but it seems implausible when you're watching a play for a character just to keel over and die. There's one interesting counter-example from the 17th century. Corneille, one of the great dramatists of the time, wrote a play about Attila the Hun. And at the end of the play, he's a total villain and he's exploiting various people. He's about to marry a woman who absolutely loathes him, and he's set two rival kings to fight against each other, to hopefully kill each other in this sort of gladiatorial combat. And just before he does so, then he dies of a hemorrhage, of a nosebleed, and order is restored. Now here, clearly, it seems implausible. It seems like the dramatist coming in, thinking, how am I going to resolve this plot? Oh, I know, it'll be almost like a sort of lightning bolt from God killing the villain at the key moment of the work. Now, it's not very aesthetically satisfying. Corneille's justification for this would be, actually, according to the historical sources, Attila the Hun did die of a copious nosebleed, possibly on his wedding night, and so there is a historical justification for it. So these things do happen in reality, but they don't necessarily make good theatre, and this is a rather, wonky, problematic play, which is probably why people haven't really heard of it very much. That type of death is real, but it is not necessarily vraisemblable. It doesn't have that appearance of truth that you need when you're watching a play. It seems as though it's the dramatist trying to sort things out. So this is an example of what we sometimes call the deus ex machina conclusion. That's a Latin expression that refers to a tradition that crops up in certain ancient plays where, when there seems to be no way of resolving the plot, a god or goddess will suddenly emerge from some sort of stage contraption, the machine, and administer justice, punishing the wicked and rewarding or reprieving the good heroic characters. Now, clearly, this is a very unconvincing type of conclusion. We get it, in a way, in Molière's Tartuffe, where the king's representative turns up on stage, supposedly to arrest Orgon, and then changes his mind and arrests Tartuffe, or reveals that he's actually been commissioned to imprison Tartuffe right at the end. And it's a very sort of ironic, self-referential, implausible sort of conclusion. So Molière, being a comic playwright, is able to play with that a little bit more because we're wanting a happy ending. So the ideal of vraisemblance is that it shouldn't do anything that will remind us that the dramatist is actually controlling events. I sometimes see it a bit like if you imagine having a lot of different clockwork toys wound up on a table all ready to go, and you release them at the same time. Now, they might bash into each other and knock some of them off the table, they might miss each other, who knows what will happen. It is theoretically predictable right from the start if you knew how everything was positioned, the angles and everything. But you can't always predict as an observer what's going to happen. You sit back and watch it happen. That is the ideal, in a way, of these sorts of plays. Everything is, the plot is already wound up right from the start, and then the dramatist supposedly takes a step back and watches, like the audience, what is going to happen. If the dramatist, if anything came in from the outside that was invraisemblable, not vraisemblable, then that would be a bit like if you wanted things to be a bit more exciting and you pick up one of the things and twist it so it bashes into one of the other ones or whatever. That would be giving away the fact that this was actually being staged and being orchestrated in some way. The ideal is that we're all sitting back watching something unfold under its own steam. So we've seen how these different rules and conventions are justified in terms of the illusion, but they have another effect as well, which is to make the experience of watching these plays a lot more intense. Because of the unities of time and place, because there's also a convention that you don't get comic episodes within a tragic plot as well, we know from the start that there will be no reprieve. It's a bit like a pressure cooker building up. When we're watching the play, we know that there isn't going to suddenly be a lurch in the plot and we'll leap forward a month and everything that we're just seeing will have been in the past, and everyone's saying, gosh, that was really stressful, I'm glad we've avoided that. We know that there won't be any sudden leaps to another location with characters who aren't involved in the plot. We know that there aren't suddenly going to be moments of buffoonery and laughter that will break the tension. And so everything increases in pressure, and it's like a pressure cooker that's building up in pressure, but maybe a broken pressure cooker that doesn't have a release valve. While we're watching the play, over the course of those normally 5 acts, the pressure increases and increases and increases. And in a tragedy, the conclusion will be catastrophic and explosive, like an exploding pressure cooker. In comedy, there will always be some happy ending. There will be a release valve finally found at the end that people hadn't predicted, maybe. So the purpose of these rules is, well, it was justified in terms of producing the dramatic illusion. In practice, what it also does is really increases the spectator's own experience of what's going on. We are sat facing an event that will become more and more exciting and tense while we're watching it, and we have no escape. As I was saying earlier, these are not then arbitrary rules and conventions being forced onto the dramatist like a straitjacket to restrict their creativity, but in effect, they're sort of like a straitjacket being imposed on us as an audience. We are bound effectively to our seats, forced to sit through as a fly on a wall, watching events that we can't intervene in, and we can see heading towards some real, often in tragedy, violent end point, and we can do nothing about it. And so actually these rules are perfectly well justified, and they make perfect sense because they make our own experience so much more exciting and so much more dramatic.